This program was made possible in part with a grant from Humanities Texas, the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Welcome to Decision Point. Usually we think of the feminist movement as anti-faith and anti-Judeo-Christianity. But when we look at the writings of early 20th century writers, we find that there's a more complex tapestry. Dr. Mimi Gladstein, who's a professor of literature at UTEP, brings a unique perspective to the whole issue of faith and feminism in American literature. Welcome, Dr. Gladstein.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
We're so glad to have you, and I know that you've been participating in the Tom Lee Month, and you've done some very interesting presentations for them. So thanks for taking the time to be with us.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah. Now you really are a pioneer in this whole area of women and literature and writings about women. You in fact taught some of the first women's studies courses and pioneered the first women's studies department in the 1970s. Isn't that right?
I did. I taught the first women in lit class.
Oh.
And then I was the first director of the women's studies program.
Right. So what prompted you to do that? That's kind of an outside the box thing for the 1970s.
Well, it was, and believe me, I got lots of criticism. Particularly from my own family, because I wasn't behaving like a good wife and mother should. And but I started looking at things and questioning, some of the, shall we say, truths that I was brought up with. And if we're talking on the subject of faith, I also was a bit of a pioneer in bringing some women's rights to the synagogue I belonged to.
And how was that?
Well, it seems I was teaching Hebrew school, and I would teach the boys, and then they would get bar mitzvah, and they would get called to the Torah. And I would teach the girls the same things, and they would get bat mitzvah, but they wouldn't get called to the Torah.
And called to the Torah meaning they get to read from the Torah?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And of course that harks back to ancient thinking about women being unclean or impure during their menses.
So that's where that comes from then?
Yeah, that's where that comes from. And so I thought this was just absolutely not fair.
Right.
And so then we began some movement there, and now in our synagogue, women are called to the Torah.
So do you think that affected the whole issue of women and women's rights has affected your faith, made you have less faith, or has it just changed the way you looked at things?
I think that things evolve, and our culture and our society and our whole way of being in the world has changed. And so I think that one can't keep, there's certain traditions, of course, that I value very much. But when we find out things, for example, I gave a paper recently on Byron and Hemingway and how the people who were there to help him killed them because Byron was fighting for Greek independence and liberty, and he got sick, he had some fits, and he had dysentery, which was the killer of most people on the battlefield in those days. Well, the fine, wonderful doctors that they brought in to help him bled him.
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
that's
well,
what they used to do.
They thought that was, state-of-the-art medicine in those days, So, and with Hemingway, he went to Menninger's Clinic, which was the top clinic for depression in the United States, and they gave him shock treatments. Now, now we find that contributes to suicidal feelings in people who are depressed. So I think with religion and women's rights, a lot of these ideas that religion, teaches about male and female roles are antiquated. they just don't fit the times.
Yeah. Now, when you were teaching your women's studies courses, how did you approach the topic? Were you looking at women writers or portrayals of women, or both?
Looking at both, looking at women writers, portrayals of women. You know, there's just so many different avenues for this.
Sure.
You know, and you know, also we studied, there were several women writing at the time that were actually writing about the issue of faith. And like there was one book by a woman named Mary Daly that's called When God Was a Woman. And she traces the early matriarchal religions and then the advent of the patriarchal religions. And, you know, and then we, you know, women's studies covers so many different disciplines.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, I would say that God is beyond male and female, you know, and certainly has the female side and the male side. But what are some of your favorite passages that talk about women and their faith and their role and that kind of thing?
Well, there's so many
stories,
different
yeah.
ones. So many different ones. I'm the person who keeps coming to my mind is Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Right.
You know, and Abraham Lincoln's telling her, "Oh, when he met her, are you the little lady that started this big war?" and I very much touched by how those women in the 19th century fought for rights. You know, and of course, essential rights. The rights of African Americans, and they couldn't see any difference in the arguments between why African Americans should have rights and why women shouldn't. Sadly, and it's one of those poignant things, is the men who were supposed to, whom they allied themselves with, betrayed them at the last minute.
Right. Yeah.
And
It wasn't the amendment for abolishing slavery also supposed to include women, but at the last minute it wasn't. Now, what was it that Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote that Abraham Lincoln was referring to?
Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Right.
And it had such a tremendous impact that, you know, people got emotionally. You know, that's what a novelist can do.
Sure. And so why did she write that? Where did that come from within her? Because that, again, was a relatively new concept to be portrayed from a literature standpoint.
Yeah, but we are talking here again about a little bit about faith in literature. And, you know, she came from a family that there were, you know, a number of ministers in. And a lot of the early, one of the writers, she wasn't really a writer. She was a speaker. And someone else wrote down her speeches, and so we're very fortunate to have them now. But there was a freed slave named Sojourner Truth.
Oh, sure.
That wasn't, you know, her real name, but
right.
She would walk around and talk, you know, and the "Ain't I a Woman" speech to me cuts right to the essence of it.
Which was what? What did she say in that?
Well, she was referring to there obviously was a minister in the audience, you know, and they were making arguments about how women were delicate and women were, you know, needed to be helped into carriages and so forth and so on. And she says, you know, that little man over there says, and she says, nobody ever helped me into a carriage. She says, I worked in the fields as hard as any man, and ain't I a woman?
Yeah. So what you're describing here is that there are a lot of stereotypes, both religious as well as societal, that some of the early literature of the late 19th and early 20th century was able to challenge and actually made a big impact on, like Harriet Beecher Stowe and others. What were some of the other stories that in which women challenged their roles, but did it in a way that was powerful and enduring?
Mary Wilkins Freeman was a writer in the late 19th century also, and she wrote this charming story called The Revolt of Mother. And in it, Mother sees that some men are building something on this hill near their house, and she questions her husband about it, and he doesn't want to be questioned. I've got nothing to say about that. And she reminds him that he had 40 years earlier promised her to build a new home for her up on the top of that hill. Well, you know, the story goes on. She finds out that in fact he's building a new barn. And she, her daughter's going to get married. She thinks that the house that they live in is not fit, you know, to have a wedding party in. Much less she's concerned about her daughter, who's kind of sickly, and who will, she and her husband will probably come live with them, and there's no room in the house. And so she questions, you know, her conscience. She thinks about providence, and there's a little bit of the story that's kind of ambiguous. All of a sudden, her brother sends a letter to her husband saying that there's a horse up in New Hampshire that, you know, he ought to come look at. It's a real good horse. And the husband leaves. And she thinks, well, Providence has created the situation, and so she moves the family into the new barn. Oh, no. Which is the Revolt of Mother, of course.
Right.
And when the minister comes to question her about it, she says, this is between me and my God.
And that's it. Yeah. So that must have been a pretty outrageous story for the time. How was that story received?
Well, she was a pretty popular writer.
Oh, okay.
And so, yes, so some of the things, it's interesting how some are received and some aren't. But that story and her writing was pretty well received.
Yeah. Now, it is amazing how a story can penetrate through people's barriers and prejudices in a way that other things can't, right?
Well, if someone is preaching to you, you have a natural resistance. But if you can begin to associate with the characters, I think you're easier to convince.
Now, you were one of the, your specialty is early 20th century literature. Is that
it's
sort of,
well, I'm schizophrenic.
Okay.
Yeah, Faulkner, Hemingway, and Steinbeck are my specialties, but also Ayn Rand.
Right. Now, Ayn Rand was not considered somebody worthy of the title literature, her and her writings. Why is that?
Well, there are some people that I guess I think Steinbeck once referred to them as the holy self-appointed, guardians of literature.
And taste.
Yeah, and one of the things that's kind of, and Steinbeck suffered from it too, is if something is popular, how could it possibly be, high literature?
Right.
And so Steinbeck was very popular, sold really well, and so he suffered from that, but Ayn Rand too. And so, because her books really...
The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah. And of course, what's happened now is so many things that she sort of foretold in Atlas Shrugged are coming true.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden she's being reconsidered.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's recently a couple of movies made based on those things that are extremely popular and have been well received. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I guess it shows that she had some enduring messages there, that's for sure. So Ayn Rand was an interesting person. Can you tell us a little bit about her?
Well, she actually came from a rather well-to-do family in Russia. And her father had a pharmacy in St. Petersburg. She graduated with a degree in history from the University of St. Petersburg, but she graduated in that period of time when during the Communist Revolution and when the Bolsheviks took over. She had like a ringside seat to the revolution.
Wow.
And she realized early on that she was not going to be free to, to create.
Yeah.
And what she wanted to create, and you'll love this story, what it has to do. She wanted to write films.
Oh, interesting.
Because she did postgraduate work in the film school.
That's pretty early.
Yeah, it was early films.
Yeah.
And I'll cut to the chase. She managed to get out of Russia in one of those short periods of time when they let people out, during that Iron Curtain time.
Yeah.
And she had family in Chicago that had movie theaters. And so they wrote a letter of introduction to her because they knew someone in Paramount Studios. And so she went to Paramount, and, you know, they didn't have a job for her.
Sure.
And so she's walking around, and this man drives a car up to her and says, "What are you doing?" And she tells him she wants to make movies. He says, "Come on, I'm making a movie. I'll show you how it's done."
Oh, my.
And guess who that was?
Who?
Cecil B. DeMille.
Oh, my gosh.
And guess what movie he was making?
What?
The Greatest Story Ever Told.
Oh, my gosh.
And
That
so
is amazing.
The first job that Ayn Rand had in the United States was as an extra in The Greatest Story Ever Told.
That is incredible.
Isn't that a wonderful story?
That is a wonderful story. But the fascinating thing is that wasn't she an atheist, or?
She was indeed an atheist, which makes it all the more ironic that her
Yeah.
first role was in The Greatest
Yeah.
Story Ever Told.
Which was, the biblical story.
Yeah, isn't the story of Jesus, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And so why was she an atheist as a result of her experience in Russia, do you know, or just
She
what was-
says that when she was 12 or 13 years old, she decided, that there was no God, and so she became an atheist.
And that just was the end of it, huh?
I guess that's
Yeah.
held through.
Now, how did she develop her rather sophisticated and profound theories about philosophy and the way the world ought to work? Which is it called objectivism?
Objectivism
Yeah.
is what she calls. But
Yeah.
I mean, she developed these ideas, and she put them forth in her novels before she ever thought about, writing nonfiction and philosophy books.
Yeah, right. Which she did later, right?
Yeah, she did later.
Right.
What happened is that a lot of people were attracted to the ideas in her novels.
Right. Which are very much more palatable than reading some philosophical treatise.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In her novel, it's more about individualism versus collectivism.
Right.
And of course, that would spring directly from her experience with communism,
yeah.
collectivism.
Right.
And for her, what didn't matter if it was fascism or communism. They were two sides of the same thing.
Sure.
It was the citizen lives for the state.
Right. Yeah. And so do you think that she was consciously developing these ideas and portraying them in the book, or she just used it as a good in her books, or it was just made a good story?
These ideas, of course, were she was very intellectual, and her ideas, she would work through these ideas. In fact, Bennett Cerf tells a funny story in his own autobiography, but he was her editor at Random House, and he said she was such a good debater. And of course, she was, I don't know what to say, she's right of right and left of left.
Yes.
But he would invite liberal friends of his to his house, for these weekend parties, and he'd invite her, and he said she defeated all of them in any argument. So she was very good at arguing her point of view.
Right. Now, would she be considered a feminist? Because the women that she portrays in her book, for the most part, are incredibly strong women, very powerful women, right?
Well, now I'll tell you another funny story.
Okay.
I was teaching that first course in Women in Literature, and I was teaching all the novels that were considered feminist novels. And my students were getting more and more depressed.
Oh, my.
And they said, "Dr. Gladstein, don't women ever succeed in American fiction?" They were dying in childbirth, they were committing suicide,
Yeah.
And this idea popped in my head. I remembered having read Atlas Shrugged.
Right.
And
Oh,
in
yeah.
Dagny Taggart runs a railroad.
Yes.
She's got 3 gorgeous men in love with her,
Right, sure.
She keeps her railroad and the affection of all the men. So I said, well, let's read this and see if there's something in it, And we read it, and we found a lot of ideas in there that we found quite relevant to feminism. And so I wrote an article, and it was published in College English, which is one of the top journals.
Right, MLA journals.
Yeah. And lo and behold, I get a letter from an editor at Greenwood Press in Connecticut that they had done a market survey and that the market was ready for an Ayn Rand companion. They had this series like, Flannery O'Connor
Sure.
companion, etc. And would I write it? And of course I was young and innocent. I had no idea. I didn't know anything about Ayn Rand and her coterie except what I had, read. And so what does a researcher do? I wrote her a letter. I sent her my article, which says Ayn Rand and Feminism, an Unlikely Alliance. And I point out how negative she was about feminists, and but I say there's ideas in that, feminists ought to pay attention to. And I got a letter back from her lawyer threatening to sue me if I wrote the book.
Oh my, yeah. That's...
So I didn't write the book, I wrote 4.
Oh, okay. There you go. Didn't work. Yeah. Well, so you said Ayn Rand was wouldn't consider herself a feminist and didn't agree with feminism. Can you explain that one a little more?
I think, and I'm having the same difficulty with a lot of what you call the feminist organizations. In that I find them taking positions that I do not think are in keeping with my idea of what feminism is. And so since Ayn Rand was opposed to such ideas as, government control,
oh, right.
And feminists wanted government to
and
impose.
Sterilization and stuff like that. Yeah.
No, but feminists, a lot of feminists wanted government to impose certain rules and
Right.
regulations.
I see.
So there was a whole lot of ways that that there was antagonism.
So it was a mixed bag. So what were the feminist ideas then that she did embrace or that she led the way in?
Well, one is individualism, and that is that, you need to be the best of whatever it is you can be. And, and so like Dagny Taggart in Atlas Shrugged, they tell her women don't run railroads, but that doesn't stop her.
Right, yeah.
And so, that whole idea of integrity, the idea of individualism, the idea of you don't sacrifice a good for something lesser.
Right.
And so all of those ideas, it seems to me, are integral to feminism.
Well, and they're also certainly congruent with faith from the standpoint
I think so.
Of integrity and character and
Right,
all
I
of
don't
that.
have, I do too, but that she didn't like that idea.
Yeah.
Of course, she didn't like the idea of somebody that she didn't know writing about her, and she couldn't control of course, she had been betrayed a lot. People
Sure.
had come for interviews, and then they did hack jobs on her,
Sure.
so she was very paranoid.
Yeah, and I think people probably have a legitimate concern about that when they're in the... How did somebody pick up her first book, Atlas Shrugged? I mean, she was basically an unknown author, right?
No, her first book was something called We the Living.
Oh, okay.
And it was it was the most autobiographical work she wrote.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because it's about a young woman in Russia
Oh, okay.
struggling with the advent of communism. And she wants to get away. Of course, her heroine in Atlas Shrugged is killed as she tries to escape. Not in Atlas Shrugged, in We the Living.
Oh, okay.
And the book was, of course, she published it in the 30s. And the 30s was what we might call the red decade in America. And, all of these communist sympathizers were appalled by her book and said she just didn't understand. Well, of course, she had lived there. They hadn't,
right,
Yeah. And
that's interesting. I had no idea that her first work was rejected because of the political content, so to speak. Not how is it from a literary standpoint? What do you think of it?
Oh, I like it.
Is it
I like
a good book?
Yeah.
I've never heard of it. I'll have to go read it.
It's published in the 30s, and then she wrote something called Anthem.
Okay.
That I teach quite often. One of the reasons is that while Atlas Shrugged is maybe the longest novel in...
Yeah, right. It's a long book. Yeah.
Anthem is a quite short thing, and it's a dystopia. And it's very interesting because, again, it's this individualism versus collectivism. And she portrays a world that has been destroyed by atomic blasts or something, and is the groups of people that are there have become so collectivist. Everything is run by a bureau,
Oh my,
and
sounds familiar.
Yeah, and that's why I think Ayn Rand is all of a sudden so relevant.
Yeah.
You know, you're assigned your role in life. Are you going to be a street sweeper? Are you going to go to the House of Scholars by a committee? And in fact, it has become so collectivist that people they have lost the word I. People refer to themselves as we.
Oh, my.
And they all have numbers rather than names. So there's liberty.
We're close to that.
Yeah, well, anyway, and it's a short, very interesting, and she published it. And, you know, We the Living sold a few copies, but the publishers didn't expect it to do very much, and they destroyed the plates.
Yeah.
And then, of course, many years later, when she became popular after The Fountainhead, they didn't have the plates.
Yeah.
But it continues to sell, and Anthem is, also continues to sell. And then she really became popular in 1943 with The Fountainhead. That was the book that propelled her onto the, as it were, national scene.
Yeah, right. Well, it's amazing how she eschewed feminism and she eschewed faith, but nevertheless her ideas are very much in alignment with, you know, what we would consider contemporary ideals related to women and ideals of individualism and freedom and all of that related to Judeo-Christian faith.
Yeah, well, I think again that's kind of where I come from, and that is I find, I study, I look, and that which I can absorb into my own way of thinking and feeling, I do. But that doesn't mean I have to take everything hook, line, and sinker.
Right.
You know. In fact, I have to write a paper. I'm going to give a presentation in Chicago at the end of November, and I call it Rand's Gender Politics, Cognitive Dissonance, because there is that strange, she argues one thing and then she argues something that is contradictory to that thing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's healthy to have that paradoxical questioning attitude toward life and toward things, because it keeps us from getting into that collectivism mindset, or the labeling groups of people or labeling ideals as liberal and conservative or left and right or Democrat Republican or
Yeah, I like to think that okay, if the Democrats have a good idea, I can like that idea. If the Republicans have a good idea, I can like that idea. But I don't have to buy either hook, line, and sinker.
And that seems like what we're being forced to do more and more today. Is
sad,
you know, if you're for this, then you have to buy the whole ball game versus you know, let's take this idea and that idea and make something worthwhile out of it. So we're almost running out of time, but it has been such a delight, and we could go on and on and on with this topic. You are a rare individual who can speak to all aspects of it, so we really appreciate you being with us.
I appreciate being asked.
Yes, well, thank you so much. So do you think that American literature portrays strong women of faith fairly? Do you think that we have something to learn from those portrayals that have gone before us? I want to know what you think. Please contact me on Facebook, Twitter, or kscetv.com. Thank you for watching.
This program was made possible in part with a grant from Humanities Texas, the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities.